Hello, everyone. In my previous video on this channel, I introduced a new mini-series. It's only going to be 3 episodes, so I gave the introduction. And what I want to do is take a standard English Bible. This is the Revised Standard Version here that I'm using. And of course, it's got the Old Testament, the New Testament, and this one even has the Apocrypha. So I want to take the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, and I want to compare it to the manuscripts and texts that we get in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's no Dead Sea Scroll Bible per se, as if the group out at the Dead Sea, sometimes identified with the Essenes, were carrying around, a Bible bound together or anything like that. But if you put together all the scrolls, you have a high percentage, up to 40%, are biblical texts that are also in the Hebrew Bible. Now, this group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they also had other books that are not included in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, like the book of Enoch and the book of Jubilees. And it looks like they did consider them scripture. But if you just take the texts that are accepted today by Christians and Jews as part of the canon of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, and you look at copies that exist in the Dead Sea Scroll Library, you could get something that could be called the Dead Sea Scroll Bible. So last time I talked about this book, which I highly recommend, the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, and it is an English translation of all the texts from the Dead Sea Scroll Library. And remember, it's hundreds of texts. And it's not complete because we don't have a complete copy of every single book of the Hebrew Bible. But it does show all of the differences. I'll show you on a slide how it works. So I decided, because people are talking about, how accurate is the Bible passed down and are there any mistakes? So as I mentioned last time, there's been a lot of buzz on YouTube. I think it's a kind of a tempest in a teapot, really. But the question of whether, if you compare the Masoretic text, that's the traditional Hebrew Bible, we have it in a manuscript or a codex called the Leningrad Codex, and you were to compare that to the texts that do survive in the Dead Sea Scroll collection, that takes us back to the time of Jesus and even probably a century before some of these biblical texts were copied and written. So I thought what I would do is take what I would choose, this is my arbitrary choice, the top 10 differences between the standard traditional English Bible that you have if you own a Bible and the copies in the Dead Sea Scrolls, putting them together. So in each case, I'll go through all 10. So in this video, I'm going to do five, the first five. And I want to do it as a kind of a countdown. And lots of apologists have made the point, well, the differences are pretty minor, they don't amount to anything. And that's actually not the case. There's some very significant differences, meaning we have several versions of the Hebrew Bible. Many of you know about the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, and that we think was done around 200 BC. The historian Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century, he is aware of that translation as well as some version of the Hebrew Bible. And I'll get into that a little bit because he refers to one of these differences in his own writings. And he has something that the Dead Sea Scrolls have, which is not in your standard English Bible. So we'll go through 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the number one will be what I consider to be one of the most significant. I'm not going to say the most significant because there are so many. There are thousands and thousands of variations. Sometimes they're very minor, just spelling and different ways of pointing vowel letters, as they're called in Hebrew. They don't amount to anything. But other times, whole words, whole phrases, many, many variants. And you can just go through this book and see them. They're all listed. So the only way to do this really is with slides because it's pretty intensive in terms of visuals. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so let's get started. Top 10 differences, biblical texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the traditional Hebrew Bible. Here is a image of the Isaiah scroll. That's one of the complete books that is contained in the Dead Sea Scroll Library. It was found in Cave 1 in 1947, and it has all 66 chapters of Isaiah, and many date it to 100 BC and maybe even slightly earlier. But let's go back 100 years before the time of Jesus of the first century. And the oldest traditional Masoretic text, and it has the vowels in it. This doesn't have the vowels, which can make a difference in terms of reading and meaning, is the Leningrad Codex, as it's called, and it dates to about 1000 AD. So you're jumping 1100 years back. And the obvious question is if you take this more recent text, I mean, it's still over 1000 years old, but it's 1000 years removed from this text, which is in the Dead Sea Scroll Library, and you compare them like in Isaiah. What would be the differences? Well, I'm not going to just do Isaiah, I'm going to do various places in the Hebrew Bible, the traditional Hebrew Bible. It's called the Masoretic text. It's abbreviated MT, Masoretic text. Okay, so this is the printed copy of the Masoretic text. You can buy it if you know Hebrew, and it notes in the footnotes the Dead Sea Scroll variants. Doesn't put them into the text, after all. It is the Leningrad Codex, but it does note them. This is the book I just showed you in English, the Dead Sea Scroll Bible. I'll put the link to this in the description. So I really recommend you get a copy. It's just wonderful to read. You can hold it in your hands, you can read through, you can check passages. Now remember, the entire Hebrew Bible isn't there, but all books are represented except for the book of Esther. And then the Septuagint. This is a Greek Septuagint. It's in Greek. We think it goes back to about 200 BC, and that's abbreviated LXX. So MT and LXX, and then I'm just calling this the Dead Sea Scroll Bible. So let's go on. Here's a page from that Dead Sea Scroll Bible, just so you can see. This is Isaiah chapter 2. And as you start reading, you notice these italics. You see all of these italics? These are differences. So end of chapter 1, end of chapter 2. So you can go on through and look at all of these. A lot of times they are minor. Let's just take this one here. Your strong ones will become as tau, and your work a spark. If you look down at number 32, it's a variant. Here it is, 32. The Masoretic text has his work a spark, whereas the Dead Sea Scroll copy says your work a spark. Well, that's a difference in meaning. It's not earth-shaking, but it is different. You can go on and find all the others and take a look at them all the way through the entire book. So that's just a sample of how the book works. So here we go with our countdown. Number 10, Revised Standard Version, Standard English Bible I've got here on my desk. Genesis 1, verse 9. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. So this is the creation hymn of the very first chapter of the Bible. And in the Dead Sea Scroll version, you've got a very significant difference, and I think it reflects an original reading. So far, no English translation of the Hebrew Bible, which is from the Masoretic text, the Hebrew of the Leningrad Codex, no English translation has put this in or any of the other variants in Genesis, and I think this one should be added. It really should. So what does it say in the Dead Sea Scroll version of Genesis? And God said, let the waters underneath the heavens, that doesn't matter much, underneath, it's just a different word in Hebrew, be gathered together in one gathering. So the standard Masoretic text says one place, but when you say one gathering, notice the alliteration and how the verb goes together, gathered together in one gathering. You see the idea? And let the dry land appear. I think that's probably original. I think that was missed by the copyist. And it was so. And then you have an additional verse. And the waters under the heavens were gathered to their gatherings, and the dry land appeared. That's not in the Masoretic text, but it's got that alliteration again, gathered to their gatherings. Now, in my translation of Genesis, which you can get, here's the link to it, jamestabor.com books. So here's that verse in my translation. Now, I do follow the Masoretic text in this translation. So I know many of you have this. I think you would really enjoy it. It's a very literal translation, but literal in the sense, as I call it, a transparent translation. It's supposed to give you the feeling of the Hebrew, lots of notes, hundreds and hundreds of notes explaining things and so forth. But notice right here, when you get to the verse that we just read, and Elohim, that's the word for God. I put in the words for God, where it's not always God. It can be various names of God and so forth. And Elohim called to the dry land, land, and to the collection of the waters he calls seas. So I put collection for the place. It's actually connected to the word mikvah, to collect together waters. But I didn't put in the gathering, but notice I put a note in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it says one gathering, producing alliteration with the verb gathered. And the reason I think this makes more sense is notice the next verse. Literally, it says, let the land sprout the sprout. But most English translations wouldn't show you that alliteration. They would say something like, let the land bring forth. But it's the word sprout. And what does the land bring forth? Sprouts. It sprouts, sprouts. Later, birds are called flyers. Let flyers fly. If you say let birds fly, you miss the alliteration. In my first example, the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve the alliteration, even in a verse that we're missing, and also don't use the word collection like a pool, but a gathering, because you're going to gather together the gathering. I do think it was probably a more original text. Is it important? I'll say it's interesting, and I think it's important on a certain level for the style and rhythm of the text. So now we go to number 9, counting down. This is a very simple one. It's still interesting. In the Revised Standard Version, again, that's the Masoretic text, Exodus talking about the children of Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who went down to Egypt. And it says the offspring of Jacob were 70 persons. Okay. King James said 70 souls, but it means persons, of course. What does the Dead Sea Scrolls say? Exodus 1:5, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 75 souls. So I'm not talking about the phrasing here. That's actually the same in Hebrew, but 70 is not 75. So the Dead Sea Scrolls counts 5 extra people. And guess what? The Septuagint, LXX, also has 75. And in the New Testament book of Acts, when Stephen is preaching, he talks about the seed of Jacob in Egypt as 75. So he's going by this Greek tradition, or maybe he knows a Hebrew version that says 75 souls, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, people have come up with all sorts of solutions. You can go online and just search what's the difference between the 70 and the 75 in the different manuscripts. And they come up with different names that could make up the extra 5 and so forth. That's not my concern. Here, we're just talking about number 9, you get different numbers. Now let's go down to number 8. You've also got different numbers. Now, this one I think you'll find kind of fascinating. We've all heard the story of David and Goliath and how tall was Goliath. Well, in the Masoretic text, he's pretty tall. 1 Samuel 17:4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. A span is half a cubit. That's 9.5 feet tall, 6 cubits, if you go by the standard cubit. And people have talked about that for centuries. Wow, that man was tall. Could that even be true? And so forth. And people talk about what's the tallest human being in the Guinness World Book of Records, and I don't even know the number. Some of you might know that. You can look it up. But here's the difference. If you go to the Dead Sea Scroll copy of First Samuel, it says, then a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. So it's basically the same. His height was 4 cubits and a span. Well, that's 2 cubits less, and that's 6.5 feet. And I believe there's a reference to Saul being a head higher than most men, and that's usually taken to be 6 feet. So Goliath is 6.5 feet. Now, which is right? How tall was Goliath? We've got two texts. One is the standard a text in all the English Bibles. All the Bible stories have told it that way. But we have an older text. It's over 1,000 years older. And also the Septuagint that was translated from the Hebrew in the second century BCE, before the time of Jesus, and Josephus, the Jewish historian, have 6.5 feet. Now, so far, I don't think any Bible has changed, but it sounds to me like you should change this to 4 cubits and a span because you've got all these earlier witnesses that are saying that's what it originally read. Now, how did it get changed? Maybe just a scribal mistake. But when people start talking about every letter is inspired and every word's inspired, and I believe Goliath was 9.5 feet tall because the Bible says it and so forth, maybe you're going by the wrong text of the Bible because you do have these differences. Okay, so that's number 8. Let's go on down. Number 7, this is probably the major change that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls in terms of a big chunk of material. It's pretty significant. I don't know that it makes a world of difference, but to have 3 or 4 lines of extra material in a text is really important. So you'll have to break into the story yourself and catch the context, but it's about a battle and a conflict between Nahash the Ammonite, and he's besieging a town, Jabesh Gilead, that's in northern Israel. So some worthless fellows said, how can this man save us? And they despised him and brought him no present. But he held his peace. And here's where the addition below goes right here. So between held his peace and 11:1, so this is the last verse of chapter 10. This is the first verse of chapter 11. You insert this in the Dead Sea Scroll manuscript. Then Nahash the Amorite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, make a treaty with us and we will serve you. So they're more or less surrendering. But look at this. Some texts call it 11:0 because it's not really a verse in our English Bible, and you can't really have less than one. The new RSV has now put this in, which I think is a major step in the right direction because it should be there. And they just call it 27 and then 27b. So look at the addition. Now, Nahash, king of the Amorites, had been grievously oppressing the Gadites and the Reubenites. So now you get some background geographically. If he's been grievously oppressing them, how was he doing it? He would gouge out the right eye of each of them and would not grant Israel a deliverer, a savior. No one was left of the Israelites across the Jordan whose right eye Nahash, king of the Amorites, had not gouged out. What a horrible thing to record. And there were 7,000 men who'd escaped from the Amorites and had entered Jabesh Gilead. And about a month later, Nahash the Amorite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And now you're getting to this verse again. So this should go here, I think. It's a good addition. It's in the Dead Sea copies. It's called 4Q Samuel. 4Q is cave 4, Q means Qumran. Now, no other manuscript has this, but Josephus, the historian, who writes the Antiquities in Book 6, 68 through 71, knows this. He knows this tradition. So we're thinking that he did have a version of 1 Samuel chapter 11 that had this addition. That takes it back to the first century. Is that earth shaking? Is that so important? Does it matter terribly? No, I suppose not, but it's certainly interesting. And it would mean that a big chunk of the original Hebrew Bible dropped out. You might know, for example, Bible codes that some people do where they count the letters of the Hebrew Bible and they skip, 200 letters and then 200 letters and 200 letters, and they begin to spell things out with secret codes that are supposed to mean something that God put into the text. But once you start making changes, if you even change a word or two, that can throw things off. And I think it's just a pretty foolish enterprise to play around with text like this when we really don't have a definitive text. We've got versions. We got a Greek version. We got the standard traditional version, and now we got the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Samaritan Pentateuch, which we're going to see is also important from time to time. Okay. Number 6. Jewish Publication Society has the Masoretic text. The RSV actually puts the Dead Sea Scroll version because it does exist in some Hebrew manuscripts. So this is about the suffering of King David. Dogs have surrounded me. A pack of evil ones closes in on me. Like lions, they maul is not, there's no verb. So I put it in brackets, but the JPS, the Jewish translation of the Masoretic text, puts a verb in as understood. Like lions, they maul my hands and feet, plural. So it does say like lions in the Hebrew text, but there's no verb. So in a way, it doesn't make sense. Dogs surround me. A pack of evil ones closes in on me. Like lions, my hands and feet. Something's missing. But that's what the Hebrew text says. That was probably changed. Ka'ari means as a lion or lions. It can be plural. Ka'ari as lions. But look at this in the Dead Sea Scroll version, for dogs are all around me. This means it's missing in the text, not that it's not there, but there's a hole in the text where you can't do the reading. Remember, these fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls are not always complete in terms of preservation. Some of them are scraps and they have wormholes or they have what we call lacuna, missing spaces. But we can tell what the original text was. For dogs are all around me, a gang of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. Now, you're going to find that in English versions because some Hebrew versions have that, and that is ka'aru. Now, notice ka'ari, lions, and ka'aru becomes a verb, karu, which can mean to dig or to pierce in various forms. There's a completely different picture here. There are no lions. Dogs are all around me, and the dogs are jumping with their teeth and their claws, and they're encircling and jumping up and piercing your hands and feet as you try to ward them off. So that makes perfect sense. Why would the Masoretic change that? Probably because Christians used it as a prophecy that Jesus would have his hands and feet pierced. You see? They try to make it a prophecy of Jesus. So if you have this form of the Hebrew word, ari, which is a yod at the end, kind of a vowel letter, or aru, which means they, it's the ending for the verb they have pierced. It makes a difference. I would think this is original. The Septuagint has they dug, which is a lot like piercing. It could I wouldn't translate it as dug, but the idea is like you're penetrating when you dig, you go into something. So you can see the idea there. So those are the first five examples. This is short. We just want to kind of get an overview of this. But in the next video, I'm going to do the final five. So five, four, three, two, one, and I'll end up with the number one difference in my view between the Dead Sea Scroll text of the Bible and the Masoretic or the traditional Hebrew text. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you'll get this book. I just picked some things to tantalize you, but look at this. If you get this, you can have endless study, and you'll have next to your Bible the Dead Sea Scroll versions of the biblical text that you can compare. And you know what? You're going to find so much that's fascinating. This is something you can do yourself. You don't need any help. You can read the introduction and understand the different references. And I think you're going to find it fascinating. You might even find many places where it will seem to you, as it does to me, that the Dead Sea Scroll Bible is better preserved. Maybe other places that it isn't. It can go both ways. But isn't that fascinating? Isn't that interesting that we have a version of the Hebrew Bible in various manuscripts that's from even before the time of Jesus, and in some cases, contemporary with the time of Jesus? So if you're interested in the Bible Jesus read, you might want to consider the Dead Sea Scroll copies because there's some indication that he was aware of some of these readings. I'll talk about that at the end of the program next time. So take care, everyone, and I'll see you soon with part two of these basic differences.